OK, well, let's get another legal perspective now. And joining me via webcam from Perth is Professor Jürgen Brommer, who's the Dean of Murdoch University's Law School. Good evening. Thank you for your time this evening, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
So, listening to Julian Assange there, would you agree with him to say that the time for appeal is over?
Well, I mean, in the final analysis, I would disagree with Julian Assange on this issue. However, we are dealing with a very complicated situation and a very complicated argument that is being made. And the major complication here lies in two facts. One, that Julian Assange is one of the few prisoners who holds the key to his prison chamber. And could easily leave the Ecuadorian embassy straight away, which is difficult to deal with in this context. And the second is the lapse of time which has passed since this whole thing has been going on. And it is interesting that the working group, in essence, states in their decision that this lapse of time constitutes a very important factor in rendering this situation disproportional. Now, of course, the consequence, if you think this to the end, is if you just spend enough time, if you're willing to sit it out over time, then what might have been a legal situation in the beginning will turn into an illegal situation. But the fact remains, Julian Assange can leave the embassy anytime. He will presumably then have to go to Sweden, answer the questions that are being posed of him, and then if nothing was done wrongly over there, he will go a free man. And then the elephant in the room, of course, is there a real risk for him to be extradited to the United States, where he might have to answer for the WikiLeaks things? So this shows a little bit of the complication, but the fact that he can leave the embassy at any time is one that the working group hasn't really discussed in their decision, and I think that leaves a lot of questions open and weakens the decision considerably.
Well, let's go on to the 5 separate reasons that Melinda Taylor from the legal team outlined as to why the detention was illegal. The first note that she mentioned was that every suspect has a right to be heard, and this has been denied in Julian Assange's case. Would you agree with that?
No, I disagree with that. You can only make that assumption, as, if I understand correctly, they are making, if you pre-assume that in this particular instance, the Swedish prosecution agencies would have to move towards Julian Assange. Then you could perhaps make a case that not enough effort was made for them to come to London, to visit the embassy, to depose Julian Assange. Whether that would have been possible in the first place, I don't know, because I don't know enough about the allegations in Sweden against Julian Assange. But that is a necessary pre-requirement. Now, that is not the usual way. We do not usually ask the prosecution agencies of one country to come to Australia if I'm unwilling, if they are after me, just because I'm unwilling to talk to them at home, because I risk, of course, I feel a risk of some sort of being held responsible. So that is a very weak argument.
OK, the other ones that were mentioned there was you've already spoken to the length of detention, which is over 5 years, which is contrary to the presumption of innocence. The last 3 points that were noted from the legal team...
If I can just interject.
Yes,
all
please.
Of this already rests on the assumption that what is happening there is a detention.
Yes.
That already is a rather courageous assertion, and in fact we've had one dissenting opinion of the working group that rests it's his dissenting opinion on exactly that fact, and that makes a lot of sense. He holds the key to this detention, at least to the part of the detention that took place or is taking place in the Ecuadorian embassy. OK, well,
the last 3 points was that Julian Assange was faced with the prospect of indefinite length of detention. They deemed that illegal. They said that the conditions under which he was staying in the Ecuadorian embassy did not comply with the minimum standard for detainees. And finally, they spoke of the execution of the European arrest warrant.
Indeed, the conditions of detention, the duration of the detention, and the fact that it might be indefinite detention in and by themselves would indeed be highly problematic. But again, all of that rests on the assumption that he is in that confinement because of some outside force. He is in that confinement, the other side would say, because he so chooses to be in that assignment, because he is, for whatever reason. And the reason, of course, is the elephant in the room, is possible extradition to the United States, of which we know very little, whether that is actually a possibility. But mind you, if we're allowed to leave the Ecuadorian embassy, that possibility of eventually being extradited to the United States, whether he remains in the UK, whether he goes to another country, whether he goes to Australia, would still remain, unless, of course, he goes to a country where that assures him that they won't extradite him, for example, to Ecuador itself.
And briefly, Professor, would you agree with Jennifer Robinson from his legal team, from Mr Assange's legal team, that a precedent has been set with the cases that we were speaking about previously?
No, there's no, for one thing, the term precedent is a legal technical term. This working group doesn't issue rulings in the first place that are court-like rulings, and even if it did, which it doesn't, they would not be a precedent in the technical sense of the word. They have looked at the facts. They have found this to be sufficient to determine that this is an illegal detention. That is certainly something that can be contested, and in my view, the better arguments would speak against that notion, but it's certainly not something that, in the technical sense of the word, can serve as a precedent.
So, just briefly before you go, would you agree with the British Foreign Secretary that this finding from the working group is ridiculous, in his words?
No, I wouldn't say it is ridiculous, because the matter is too complicated. That is too easy, because we do have this situation of a prolonged standoff. I'm not myself entirely sure whether other ways might have existed, reasonable other ways to fulfill the Swedish request. That would depend on determinations on the Swedish facts and background of those allegations there. Whether really all avenues have been pursued to bring this to a more timely end. But that goes for both sides. And that is, I think, the core problem here. That is also nobody has the right to just sit somewhere and wait for everything else to come to that person. So the determination of the real and realistic risk of extradition to the United States versus following the justified legal situation in Sweden and requests of the Swedish authorities is something that has to be looked at in more care. And one of the weaknesses, I think, of the decision is that it doesn't do that.
Okay.
It doesn't speak to the risk of being extradited to the United States, and whether Julian Assange has a legitimate right not to be extradited to the United States to ask for any charges that might be brought to him against him over there. There's no discussion of that. That is one of the weaknesses of this decision. But to call it ridiculous, I think, is going too far.
Okay. Professor Jürgen Brammer, Dean of Murdoch University's Law School, thank you very much for your time here this evening.
Thank you.
Well, I'll bring you back in here, Mark Davis, investigative journalist.